I think it's story time, right? And I
It
actually do
is
have
story
one.
time.
It is. And
I got
so
my
as Greg
teddy
was
bear, my
talking,
blanket.
I had a story that would have riffed off that really well, but I thought, given the what we were talking about with Greg, I should really talk about 2014 in Hanoi when I was the air attaché there, and of course the oil rig crisis erupted, and there were protests in Vietnam, large scale protests. And by the way, if you ever spend time in a communist country, large scale protests usually bad, right? You don't want, because sometimes they end up in very different places than you'd want them to if you are, say, a single party state and you want to stay the single party. So, but as these things erupted, because Vietnam dealt with these in part by having an assertive transparency campaign. They actually put the videos of them getting pushed around by the Chinese ships out on YouTube. And so Vietnamese people got up in arms and there were protests. And so what the Communist Party did was they just tried to maybe organize the protests so that the protests would be properly channeled and then sort of dispersed, and that, at least they'd be organized protests since they weren't protesting against the party. But as time went on, things got a little out of hand, and some criminal elements got involved, and the protests got a little off track, and were no longer organized. And some factories were looted, and not just Chinese factories, but Taiwanese factories and Korean factories and other factories. And so, at a certain point, the prime minister of Vietnam puts out three text messages to everyone in the country. And so I remember getting these three text messages on my phone. And in short, what they said was, "This has been fun, but this is over now. We're not doing protests anymore." And so it just so happened that I had picked that day that I was going to go out and take a look at the protests outside the Chinese embassy, just because I was an attaché, and part of what you want to do is give your sort of boots on the ground view of what's happening. So I went there, and the first place I went was the Opera House, which is where the protests were getting started. And it was during my cab ride to the Opera House where I was getting these text messages saying, "Oh." So as I get there, I noticed that there is nobody protesting, there is nobody gathering, but there are a lot of security people running around. So I said, "Huh." So apparently, at least whatever else is true, is the protests are not organizing at the Opera House today. So I get in another cab and I go over to Lenin Park. So, and no kidding, in the middle of Hanoi, there is a big statue of Vladimir Lenin, and he is standing right across the street. Lenin Park is across the street from the Chinese embassy. And this is where they would always culminate. And once again, Lenin Park on this date was completely barricaded off by these temporary barricades. There were security people just flooding the area. And so, in fact, there was a truck that was driving down the street and picking up motorbikes with this crane and putting them on the back of the truck and driving them away. And any group that would get together with more than two or three people would be kind of broken up. And so at this point, I was really kind of bemused by all of this. And so I walked up to one of these fellows, one of the security people whose job it was apparently to sit next to the barricades around Lenin Park and turn people away if they wanted to go inside. And so I went in, and using my broken Vietnamese, I said, "Can I go see Lenin?" And he says, "No." And I said, "Why not?" And he says, he had to think about that for, he said, "Safety." And I said, "I feel very safe. There's so much security here. I feel very safe." And I said, "Safety for who?" And he thought about that for a second. And he said, "Foreigners." And so at that point, I left the man alone because, of course, there was nothing he could do. He's going to do his job. And I was just kind of being a jerk, frankly. But that was the day the protests ended. And it was extremely effective. They just sort of flooded the zone with security, and nobody got together. And if they're not together, you don't have to break them up.